Welcome to everybody. This is the ninth annual San Antonio Book Festival, which is super exciting. And you are in My Novel and Me, Autobiography in Fiction. Um, we are going to be talking about three really important YA novels, and you are going to want to read these. I'm going to start off by, first of all, thank you for coming. And my name is Vanessa Eichler, and I want to introduce you to our amazing authors. First of all, we have Darcie Little Badger. She has a PhD in oceanography, and she is a self-described fan of the weird, beautiful, and haunted. Her critically acclaimed debut novel, Elatsoe, appeals to so many different readers. It's a murder mystery. It's got a sassy heroine full of mysticism and mythology, and it's perfect for anybody who has ever been blessed enough to have the love of a good dog. We also have the honor of speaking to the Prince Medal winning novel, Everything Sad Is Untrue, a true story author, former publisher and former pastry chef, Daniel Naeri, and his fictional autobiography. I thought of it as one part Scheherazade, one part family history, and a million parts humanity. Our trifecta is made complete with author Ray Stoeve, who created the young adult, middle grade, trans and non-binary voices master list. It tracks fiction works by trans and non-binary authors about trans and non-binary characters. Ray's novel, Between Perfect and Real, is a story of a closeted trans boy who decides to come out when he is cast as Romeo in the school play. I think it will especially appeal to theater nerds and lovers like myself. So we're going to get started really soon. But before we start, I want to remind you guys, you can purchase all of these books from our local San Antonio bookstore, Nowhere Bookshop. That's our festival's official bookseller. Independent bookstores have had a hard time during the pandemic, so we urge you to support them as well as our authors by clicking on the Buy the Book button on the festival website. Also, don't forget, these authors are here to talk to you. So please, if you have questions for any of them, put them in the Q&A box. It's right there. It should be on the right side of your screen, I think, unless yours looks different than mine. If it does, I'm sorry. But there is a Q&A box, so please send your questions in. All right, we got to get started because there's so much to talk about. So I'm going to start with Darcie. Darcie, Elatsoe incorporates so many types of mythology. We've got indigenous North American mythology. We've got European fantasy. We've got all of this. Can you tell us about this world you created that includes kind of everything?
Yeah, and there are a couple reasons why I went that route. First, I should explain that Elatsoe takes place in a contemporary version of the United States, specifically Texas, that's very similar to the world we live in right now. But like you say, there's things like these monsters and magics and stuff that come from various cultural sources. First of all, I'm biracial, so I am Lipan Apache. Like I'm an enrolled member of the Lipan Apache tribe of Texas. So I never describe myself as half Lipan because you don't do that. You know, we don't do blood quantum. You're never half Lipan. But I do describe myself as biracial because my father is white, specifically Irish American, and it is important to acknowledge that. Growing up, I had influences from both my maternal and paternal side of the family because my parents were both very supportive of me, and both of them knew the power of stories. I can say that perhaps some of that in Elatsoe is coming up the way I was brought up. But also, you know, it's really the experience of being indigenous. I'm Lipan Apache. We're from Texas, so especially living in Texas and having your culture, and yet also interacting with people of many different other, you know, cultures. So to me, I figured it would just be a very realistic representation of this country just to acknowledge all of these very different influences coexisting together. But yeah, it was fun, and what I especially liked though was the chance to include these monsters that made appearances in stories I heard growing up, but that I'd never really seen in any of the many fantasy books I read because many of these traditional stories are told, orally, spoken. They aren't necessarily written. So these stories that I learned from my mother, she would learn from her mother, and so on, so on. So it was very cool to just to, I say, play with that because the stories that I use, I do put my own influence on them. I do make alterations to some of the monsters to make them my own because this is a fantasy book. And it was just really cool to do that, and then to like stick in a reference to Lord Oberon of the Fairies. But yeah, that was a good question. I appreciate talking about that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And these books are encompass so many different things. So it's going to seem like we're really, changing gears a lot here at first, but I want to give everyone a chance to talk before we do like the question for everyone. So Ray, I would love to talk about your main character. Dean, he has to figure out, part of his struggle in the story is figuring out what pronouns are right, feel right. Can you give us your perspective on the importance of pronouns?
Yeah. I mean, I think like pronouns are so interesting because so many of us take them for granted. Like a lot of times when I've mentioned pronouns in conversation or been in rooms where someone will say, all right, go around and everyone say your pronouns and your name, there's usually someone who's like, huh? Like they genuinely don't know what that means. And it's not because they're ignorant, but it's just because we take for granted the way that people refer to us, in third person, and we don't, there's no space for thinking about like flexibility in pronouns, for example, or pronouns changing over time, or like, um, cis people tend to think of themselves as not having a gender really in the way that trans people do. And so pronouns are seen as a thing that trans people have, but everybody has pronouns. And to me, like you said, the importance of pronouns is that they're important. They, using the right pronouns for someone else is a sign of respect and acknowledgement of who they are and the fact that they're a person at all, and then going through the process of figuring out what fits for you is a really key part of like embracing your authentic self too. Like for me, I've cycled through a number of pronouns in my life, and they them is the one that makes me feel the most seen, the most like respected, and I think that's what pronouns are about. It's a sign of respect for yourself and the other person.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think that a lot of us are still learning about this, and it's really helpful, and I really appreciate that you're able to help educate us. It's, as an educator, I appreciate what you're doing, so thank you. Daniel, so in your book you talk about this mixture of sort of happy coincidence or miracles and red tape that allowed your family to finally end up in Oklahoma, right? The relative safety of Oklahoma. As somebody who had to immigrate, because of danger to your family, can you speak to us about your opinion, the current state of the immigration process in the United States, and how it affects asylum seekers in particular?
Sure. Although, I just happen to be one. I would never say I'm an expert or anything. The part that I tried to highlight in the book, which is my story, is about the sort of the daily grind of it. Sometimes people wonder, like, why are there even refugee camps? Like that, we don't actually address this often, and the answer is because they have to wait around for a long time. Like it's just an extended homeless situation. And why do they have to do that? Well, when fundamentally as a refugee, it's a slightly different subset of immigrant, right? And the subset is the place you're leaving is a place that wants to kill you. Like the state has fundamental, either because there's so many destabilized scenarios that create refugees, right? So either like a particular faction will come to power that is enacting genocide, or in certain totalitarian states, or you become a sort of a enemy of the state. And so whatever it is, fundamentally, what it means is you've been disowned by the state, and by that I mean all your documents are moot, like they're just gone. So like I didn't have a birth certificate, we didn't have a citizenship certificate to Iran. So when you show up to the offices of the United Nations or wherever, to any embassy in the country of wherever you are, because with refugee scenarios, it really is walking over borders or sneaking onto planes in our case and showing up someplace. You have no ID. So, and there's no way for you to prove that this is your mother. So as a child, it manifests itself in the form of you get taken into a room with some very stern looking people, and they're asking, and it's not their fault, I guess, that they're stern looking, but they're asking you questions to fundamentally figure out if your mother is actually your mother, which if you've never been asked those questions as a kid, you get the sense that the stakes are really high because, well, you can imagine, but as with a kid, you have fundamentally like somewhat random thoughts, right? You're it's very an emotionally fraught situation. So you get a lot of scenarios where someone is trying to answer whether or not, one, or is this person your parent? Did you come here alone? Did you come here with people? Were you ever coerced when you came here? Do you have any documentation? Where did you live beforehand? And these are questions that they're asking, and then they're asking again at a later date to verify. And so, early on in the experience of any refugee is this experience of not being believed, right? Or maybe they are being believed. That it's a system, it's a bureaucracy that's speaking to you, and it is speaking to you from the position of skepticism, right? It's trying to suss out whether or not you're a bad actor, whether or not you're someone who should be given asylum. So you're being assessed. And that assessment sort of comes out in the form of the book, where this narrator is quite literally obsessed with how he's being perceived, how everything he's saying he's backing up. So he's because in those rooms, kids get very nervous, and they'll be like, yes, I came alone. No, someone drove us, but we don't know him. It was a taxi person. There was someone in the cab. And there's this like panic of, what is the exact truth of, did you come here alone? That's not a simple question. And they get tied up in what looks like a very suspicious, testimony. And so, because before this, of course, all the adults in your life have also been telling you how distinctly not to look suspicious. So if ever you want to look very suspicious, try to not look suspicious, and you got yourself sorted. So, these are the kinds of experiences that I think, when we try to, I think fundamentally what I always try to start with isn't the geopolitics of the moment, it's the ethics of the moment. And when you have somebody in a room, I bet you within 5 questions I could make you so nervous you start lying about your life. I promise. And it's such an intense experience, and it's such a repeated experience. And a refugee camp is fundamentally people who are waiting and doing those interviews and that paperwork for Canada, Australia, UK, America, and you're trying to get into different places. So it's a time of extreme like duress. And so I try to start there. I try to start by just expressing what life is like. I don't really get into the argumentation about open borders or who's legitimate or who's not, or whether they're going to come here and help or hurt. I mean, I fundamentally think refugees are good for the country. Like we really know how to hustle, and we want to get things going, all that good stuff. Like I could make that argument, but my opinion doesn't start there. My opinion, when I'm trying to talk to people, starts with, hey, do you actually even know why refugee camps exist? Like, why don't they just go home? So that's I think where I would begin.
That's interesting. This has nothing to do with anything, but in Texas, we now teach the Holocaust every year, and it's not taught in a class, so the librarian teaches it, because anything that's not taught in a class, the librarian teaches. And it's always interesting to me because every year the kids are like, why didn't they just leave? Why didn't the Jews just leave Germany? And I'm like, it's not that you can't, like, it's not, nobody would take them. I mean, it's not that easy. And that's always one of the big aha moments for them, you know?
Why doesn't everybody live in Graceland? I don't know. Right. I don't know why everybody doesn't live in Graceland or where Disneyland.
Right. But I think it's important for us as Americans and for our children to realize that that humans all over the world do not have all the options. We just don't. And it's important to remember that. So thank you. So now I'm going to kind of ask a question, throw it out to all of you, and you can take turns answering. But before I do, please remember, attendees, that these authors want to hear from you. They're here to connect with you. So if you have any questions, throw them in that Q&A, and we will get to those towards the end of our session. So this session is my autobiography and me, and I would love to hear from each of you how much of your book is fiction, how much is influenced by your own life. I'd love to start with you, Daniel, actually, because you have this quote in the book that I just loved so much that I have to read it. You say, Persians aren't liars, they're poets, which is worse. Poets don't even know when they're lying. They're just trying to remember their dreams. Can you tell us about that balance between fact and poetic license, please?
Sure. Yeah. So this segues from like where I began, because I began thinking about those scenes of trying to express your life to a skeptical audience. And how quickly, if we were to begin like investigating your memories, if we were to say, hey, tell me a great memory you have about your grandpa, and if you have one, you start telling me about it, and we start asking. It's amazing how quickly people get to a few sort of subcategories of memories, which is, well, I didn't live it, but like my mom used to tell me that like every Sunday we would go up on my grandpa's roof, and they would dry fruit there and sit around and eat dried fruit and tell stories. And it's like, oh, that's cool. So you have all the little doll pieces of the humans, and then you arrange them based on someone else's description of it. It's like, yeah, that's one kind of memory. Or I saw this photo, and I swear I remember the moving parts of that photo or something. And very few, as I was going through it, I was realizing very few of my memories are the ones that like I lived. I could recreate for you everything that was happening like on this side and on this side and the whole experience of it. Those were very, very difficult to come by for most of my family because we left so early when we were in Iran. So I started to think about how much memories or stories we tell ourselves, and how much they change, and how, if we're really being honest with ourselves, or if frankly if we have a sibling in our life, how differently we remember every aspect of that. So I had a lot of anxiety around like, oh shoot, like almost nothing I put down I am really capable of fact checking to the like scrutiny that I would want for a memoir. And yet that's like what I think all memoirs are failing at. Like fundamentally I have a deep skepticism of the memoir genre. And so I was like, all right, well, the only way I'm ever going to write this story then is to front load all of that skepticism and all of that anxiety and put it and say to as a narrator, like, this is the way I remember the story as a kid. Quite frankly, there are parts that even I suspect aren't true, but I swear to you, it's the memory I have. Like, this is what I think about my grandmother. It's the only memory I got. And this is what my mother says is wrong with the memory, and this is what my dad says is wrong with the memory. I'm still holding on to it. I don't care. And I'll sort of disclose all that. So to that end, like, if you just take it at the face value of the narrator, then to answer the question, uh, I wrote it exactly as myself. I wrote there's almost nothing I changed except for some characters in Oklahoma. You compile some people and you change names and you put dialogue where you weren't in the spirit of what happened and things like that. But yeah, fundamentally it was sort of my life. I was writing it as though it was a memoir. But then believing also that the memoir is a very shady genre. We gotta call it something else. Stuff I wish you thought about me. How about
Actually,
that?
it's really cool because as a librarian, a middle school librarian, all the biographies, all the memoirs are shelved with the biographies, so kids miss out on those a lot. And I think you might have made a good choice because this one's in the fiction section where they all hang out. So I think
Right. With all those cool fiction kids.
those cool fiction kids.
Yeah.
So Ray, speaking of cool kids, I was a theater nerd. Obviously, reading your novel, I was like, obviously Ray was a theater nerd. Um, So my question is though, how much of Dean's experiences were your own? Were you able to own your identity in high school? Did you face the same kind of bullying? Can you speak to us about that?
Yeah, I love this question and this topic. And Daniel, I love what you said. And that quote is amazing. Like, as a former spoken word poet, I relate. But I think it's so funny because I feel like fiction by marginalized people, and then specifically like queer and trans people as a subset of that, are often like assumed to be autobiographies in sort of like the literal sense. And like when I think about Dean's story, nothing about that entire book, the story arc, happened to me. It's total fiction. Like, Dean is not, you know, like a stand-in for me, but a lot of the feelings and a lot of the sort of kind of like cornerstone experiences of like the first time you wear a binder and the first time that you like wear gender affirming clothes, like those were directly drawn from my experience in terms of like the feelings. And I often think about I was at Tin House, their first YA fiction workshop, and Morgan Parker, who's brilliant, a poet and fiction writer, was one of our instructors. And we had a whole kind of like seminar about this topic. And I can never remember exactly what she said whenever I want to quote it, but she said something about how like the facts, whatever, like what matters or what is truer is the feelings. And that's like the way that I think about fiction in general, is like I also kind of have a distrust of memoir and like the limits of it and what it can really do. Because I went back and forth for a long time wondering if like thinking about writing various kinds of memoirs. But I feel like what I've come to is that like I can only get to, sometimes it feels like fiction is more real than the literal truth. And I can only really get to the reality of an experience by making things up. Because what is like so resonant about the experience isn't the literal facts of like, did this happen to me or not? Although the theater games and the layout of the theater itself even is directly ripped from, like, that's the high school theater
totally.
that I was in. But yeah, so for me, I think like that's what I would say, is that like the feelings are ripped from my own experience. And but the like literal facts were not. Like I didn't have access to like terminology about gender as a kid in the early 2000s. Like, I knew that trans people existed in sort of this like fuzzy way, the T on the end of LGBT, or like, the like trans women who were often mocked and exploited on like Jerry Springer or the Maury Show. But that was like the extent of my interaction with, like trans people, or like a complicated idea of gender in general. Things were like pretty normative in the early 2000s. So it really wasn't until I was 19 or so, and then like throughout that sort of 10-year period of my 20s that like they them became like a pronoun, and non-binary became a word that people use, and I started to know people who were using those words, and started to know more trans people and know more queer people. Like, I was the first, not the first, but like I was one of the only people out at my high school that I know of in Seattle, in the early 2000s, which people think of as a very progressive place and time, maybe.
Yeah.
But like, I didn't, I can look back and retroactively like think of like my experience, but I think at this point in my life, I prefer to just be like, it was all me at different points in time, and yeah, I'll just wrap it there.
I think in my heart of hearts, I want to believe that Ray had a Mr. Harrison who was that theater teacher who got you.
I wish.
And I feel like I'm tearing up now, because I used to teach theater, and I was like, I hope that they had this experience of having that adult, that got it, and that, so I'm glad that teacher's in the book, and I'm sorry that teacher wasn't in your life.
I have not a great teacher, so don't worry.
Good.
And great librarians too, like school librarians.
Yay!
Were like my friends.
Awesome. Okay, so Darcy, moving to you, same kind of thing. Throughout your novel, I kept reading about, I kept hearing about the main character, Elatsoe's sixth grade, and it became like, I felt like, is this like a real, like, is this Darcy's sixth grade? How much of Elatsoe's experience and how much of the Lipan Apache traditional stories are in there? And especially I want to know about the sixth grade.
Yeah, and I gotta say the most autobiographical, that's how you say it, thing about the book is the ghost dog Kirby, because that's the one instance where Kirby's just based off of my first dog, Kirby, who is also an English Springer Spaniel, and just the sweetest dog I have. I have a lot of like Pomeranians and Chihuahuas, and they're darling, but sometimes they're a little bit anxious, and they like, yeah. Kirby was always just a big snuggle. He was also really smart, and I taught him a whole bunch of tricks. The other dogs typically just learn how to sit and shake. So I love my Rosie. She's my Chihuahua now. You will see in the book that there's an owl named Rosie who fights his own shadow, and that's based off of my Chihuahua. But in terms of like the themes, the importance of family in Elatsoe and the support that Ellie receives from her family is strongly based on my own. Actually, on my mother's side of the family, not so much on my father's side, but on my mother's side, which is the native side, I have a very extensive understanding of not just who my living relatives are, but my family tree going back. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is we have to know, in order to be enrolled in the tribe, you have to know who you are. But also just the importance of the knowledge that my great grandmother, for example, passed on to us. Without that, without them passing on our culture during some of the most dangerous and violent periods in Texas, to be an Apache, y'all, it got pretty bad in Texas. I'm just going to put it there. We were a border tribe, and both the U.S. and Mexico at different points were trying to massacre us. So the fact that they were strong enough to carry on these traditions and to ensure that I, in the 21st century, now know who I am, is just really a wonderful thing. So that's why the sixth grade grandma, who's just this strong woman, there's a lot of strong women in my family too. But why her passing down the knowledge to wake up ghosts is kind of a parallel to just knowledge in general in my family. But another thing I noticed just reading through Elatsoe is oftentimes it starts autobiographical with injustices, including, and I don't discuss how this, but including the main murder in the book. These are based on injustices in my family, but the fictional part is that justice is eventually found. One thing I do talk about is there's this scene where the mother kind of thinks back on her childhood and how someone tried to abduct her at knife point, and this man is crushed by a ghost woolly mammoth. And that is directly based off of an experience my mother had as a child, and she did actually escape by running away with her friend. But I used to say man, but she just actually told me there were other men in the car, so it was like a group of men. They got away. So a lot of this in Elatsoe is thinking these great injustices have been done to my family, to other Native people, and I wanted just to write a story where the protagonist and her family has the power to then bring these evil men and forces and all sorts of things to justice, because I do think that's important. And hopefully, it will encourage readers just to seek out their own forms of justice, which is, what my family is doing now for other reasons. It's endless. It's endless. But the end result, I hope that someday we will be like Elatsoe and our family will kind of have some peace. But yeah, so it's difficult too. So sometimes it's like wish fulfillment, but there is a very strong autobiographical core to this fantasy book.
It's interesting because one of the things that I was really that I guess noticed or that stuck out to me, the main antagonist in your book is this man who is wealthy, he's well educated, he's well connected, and his community really almost sees him as almost like a messiah figure. And it just felt like very symbolic of a lot of people who get away with things, which is kind of what you were talking about. Can you tell me more about your choices around that character?
Yeah, and I'll try to avoid spoilers, but you learn very early who murdered Ellie's cousin, and it's this doctor named Abe Allerton, and he's well connected in this community called Willoughby. So that's not actually the mystery. The mystery is why he'd do it. And the question is because he seems like a very nice guy, in that he is a doctor who saves lives. And indeed, you find out that he actually does save a lot of lives. And there's this kind of trade-off that he makes, saving the lives of the people he deems worthy at expense of the lives of people he deems unimportant. And he's kind of based on colonization, I have to say, especially when it comes to our dispossession of my people. One group of people taking land, taking resources at the expense of another. So there is that trade-off. And things aren't always black and white, because really this doctor can justify to himself why he would want to save the lives of this young and promising person. And the cost might be heavy, but he might feel like it's a cost that he needs to make. So it was kind of my way in fiction to try to approach a very difficult and ongoing issue that isn't always so easy just to work out, because I have heard from readers who say, I can kind of see why Abe Allerton would do what he does. And you're supposed to. Of course, he is the bad guy, but to himself and to his community, they do justify it.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you think about it. Ray, let's talk about your protagonist, Dean. Dean, as I mentioned earlier, Dean had several good friends and teachers and things that really were supportive and helpful. And then he also had family members and friends who, I guess maybe the right word would be like misguided. Like maybe they wanted to be helpful, but they were very aggressive or even offensive. And can you speak a little bit about the difference between the two, keeping in mind that no matter how well-meaning you are, you can still hurt and offend people? And where is that line between being supportive and trying to understand and just making it all about yourself instead of the other person, I guess?
Yeah, I think in the book, that was something that I, like, for me, this book was, like, the title is very representative of what I wanted to do with it, which is to just honor, like, the messiness and complexity, not only of Dean's journey, but, like, the lives of everyone around him as they relate to him and in their own life. And so I kind of tried to, like, pay attention to everyone's backstories and everyone's sort of, like, complicated reasons why they do what they do, or, like, and then in relationship to Dean, like, the different places everyone is in their ability to, like, fully show up for him. And so, you know, on the one hand, we have, like, Ronnie, who is the best friend that I wish I would have had, and that everyone, I think, wishes they would have had.
Everyone, yeah.
And he's, like, a very special, important character to me. And he, like, kind of acknowledges there's stuff I want to understand. Here's maybe a different place you could go, like the support group I found, you know, might be good, and, like, but is absolutely, like, doesn't. It's interesting that you, like, mention understanding, because Ronnie doesn't get caught up in his, like, whether or not he understands. He just is like, okay, this is my friend, and, like, this is what he needs me to do, and I see him and I love him, and I'm going to show up. And I think that, like, understanding is actually a place that people often get stuck on, that they don't need to, because like, understanding, sure, like, it might come with time that you start to, like, unwind your own perspectives of gender and the ways that they've been taught to you, and start to expand your mind about, like, what gender is and what it can be. But it's not actually, like, the most important thing in the moment. It'll happen over time. And I think, you know, at the other end of the spectrum, Dean's mom, you know, and Dean's bully, Blake, represent, like, kind of the opposite of Ronnie in a way, where, like, Blake is very wrapped up in, like, traditional, like, ideas of masculinity, that, like, he should have gotten the lead role, you know, that, like, here Dean isn't, like, even really a guy in Blake's mind, and Dean got this lead role that Blake should have gotten. And then Dean's mom, who is really, I think, caught up in, like, but I don't get it. How can you be that if XYZ conditions aren't met, that I've learned this is what a man is, you know? And I think where we see Dean's mom start to shift is when there's this kernel that's planted where she starts to realize, and I think it's funny when you spend so much time with a book and then you're like, oh wait, I don't actually remember if that line made it in there in the end. But I know at one point I had a line where Dean, like, says to her, like, you don't need to, like, something along the lines of, like, you don't need to understand, you just need to, like, just accept it, you know, just use my pronouns, you know, something along those lines. And I think, like, the seed is eventually planted at the end. I guess this is a spoiler alert. So spoiler alert. Understand that she doesn't need to understand. You know, she just needs to show up and, like honor what Dean needs.
Love him. Yeah. Thank you. All right, Daniel. Very important topic here. That I appreciated that you touched on in your book several times, and that is pooping. You had, I have to read this because I feel like yes. You said you can tell a lot about cultures by how they handle pooping, because it's the other half of their cuisine. So I felt like, yeah, I felt like it was really a metaphor for cultural differences, and the fact that, you know, we often, as humans, I think all humans, maybe Americans in particular, when there are cultural differences, it's always like, ew, you're different, ew, what's going on, ew. And I felt like your novel did such a great job of sort of tying all those things in and showing us the universality of it, the connectedness between us all. How, in your opinion, why are those cultural differences so terrifying, and how can we do a better job of finding those universal truths?
That's a big question. Thank you. Well, so on the topic of why are they so important, or why do they get us so much? I think that line sort of refers to why they do. I mean, taboos, especially around, like, well, let's call it production, is really are really strong. There's this French film from like the 1940s. No, it's later than that, but 50s, where there are these like rich folks sitting around, and they're all like defecating together around a table, like they're each sitting on a toilet, and then every once in a while one of them will sneak off to like in a separate room to have a meal, and of course the idea in the film is just like, well, why do we have that taboo where we can only sort of produce by ourselves, but we, and in different cultures in the past we haven't. So in some ways it's trying to talk about the arbitrariness, or at least the relative nature of what we decide is taboo. And I really wanted to pick some of those elements in which, like, how can he seem most different? And so that's one side of it. Is I literally just I know that in the East we have a completely different way of going to the bathroom. Our toilets aren't like this chair, and it's super hard to get used to the chair, man. Also, I can send you some medical documents about research that shows that the chair ain't the best way to do it, and maybe you should invest in like a little thing that lets you kind of lets your feet come up, like a footstool in front of your toilet in case you feel blocked. We can talk about it later. My mom was a doctor, so like all my life, anytime I was sick, she'd be like, "When you don't flush," and then she would come in to look in order to like check my stool for like, so I became very, very interested in human production as that. But I also can I give you the highfalutin aspect of it? Can I give you the poetic poop story? Because some of it I find poop hilarious. I find the taboo of poop hilarious. I do find the whole like nature of it being the second half of your cuisine. I like all that stuff. I think it's fun. But the highfalutin part was, I'm also kind of super fascinated with it. After in college, I read a couple books that were sort of related. One is Rushdie talks about it a lot in Midnight's Children, and he talks about pickling as well as this idea of like just like, let's abstract like eating and producing as like everything that you take in and then everything that you put out into the world. Mm-hmm. And there's this like Renaissance thinker by the name of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, right? And he writes this essay that he kind of talks about this, right? It's called Orations on the Dignity of Man. And in it, he's sort of talking about, in this case, mankind. He's trying to think about, when people act at their worst, he describes them as lowering themselves to, just a manner of a beast who will only take in and then will only defecate. That's their entire purpose and their entire like manufacture in life. They're a creature that is just going to eat a lot of resources and then poop out a lot of resources, and he says there's this higher, nobler calling, right, in terms of with one another, that we can produce a whole lot more than just feces. And when you do that, he describes it as being akin to the angels. And of course, what do the angels produce? They produce art, they produce beauty, they produce song. And so I started to think about that a lot, about how this is a lot of ways a metaphor for the artist, right? And we get twisted when we think about it, because often we've seen the meme and the stereotype of like the tortured artist, the artist who in fact somehow must be tortured. And I don't necessarily ascribe to that, but I do think that the job of an artist is related, and the relation isn't seeking damage or having toxic relationships. It's rather to take whatever pain, and boy, you're gonna get a lot of pain. It's gonna happen. If you live in this life, you're gonna eat a lot of food. You're gonna take in some pain. With the artists, their job anyway, or their goal, or maybe their calling is to produce something else, is somehow in this body, in this mind, and in this soul to take in the raw material of pain and horror and trauma and manufacture something beautiful out of it. Manufacture these novels. I love, man, I've been on panels with Darcy. I haven't gotten a chance to be on them with you, Ray, and I hope I get to. Every time I hear about it, it's gorgeous. And I see that, that's what she's doing. The task of the artist is to take the war that gets inflicted on you and to produce peace. That metaphor, right? Of like taking that raw material is directly related to food and poop and watching my mother take in a whole lot of pain, and instead of being one of those hurt people who just puts out pain, and there are many characters in the book who do that, she somehow didn't, and some like miracle of factory manufacturing literally happened because the raw material is just pain. So how in the world are you putting out love and beauty and things like that when that's all you've been fed? That's the mystery I wanted to explore. And in some ways, as a 12-year-old narrator, he relies on the metaphor of poop. That's what he had. There's no Mirandola or Renaissance essays in this book. Feel free to don't worry.
I really appreciated all the poop talk. And it's funny, you said you're like, well, my mom was a doctor. That's awesome. My mom wasn't. And she still came and looked at my poop all the time when I was little. And it's like, it kind of damaged me a little bit because I was always like, can I just have this for myself? Can this just be me time? Yeah. So I appreciate that, and that is another thing we have in common, even though we pooped in very different ways growing up. But actually, what you were saying segues perfectly, I think, into another question I had for the panel, which is this: I would love to hear about your choice of titles. And Daniel, if you don't mind, I would love to start with you, because in your book, you talk about putting in pain, and you just talked about putting in pain and coming out with producing something better. But in your book, all of the painful things that you touch on, they're dealt with almost in just like a nonchalant way, just like it's just a fact. Like there's no drama around it. It's just a fact. And I felt like that had something important. There was some important connection there to your title. So can you tell us what?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to be quick. I don't want. So the title initially, it comes from a quote in The Lord of the Rings. I was very much a Lord of the Rings nerd, where Gandalf is dead, everything is horrible, the end is nigh, and Samwise looks up, and at a moment they hear the sound of laughter and see Gandalf the White coming. He's sort of returned, even though they thought he was dead, and Samwise asks this like delightful, naive question, which is like, is everything sad going to become untrue? Like, this is unbelievable. Your death became untrue. Like, are all the things going to become untrue now? And it's one of those hopeful, childlike kind of questions that I adore, and refers to sort of this idea that the hope that you have in the future is a direct effect of the experience you're going to have of the present. And I thought that's what a lovely lovely thought. And so I sort of had Everything Sad Will Become Untrue as the title, which is the exact quote. And then I was like, oh, it doesn't quite fit my narrator. My narrator is a little bit more brash than Sam, and he's a little bit more certain than Sam, and he's also a little bit more like willing to assert stuff that he only kind of partly knows. And so he seems like the type that sort of already claims the future as the present. So he said Everything Sad Is Untrue, and of course, there's a lot of very deeply true sad things. So it's definitely a title that is asking you at the jump to question this narrative, to like work with him on it. You see him exploring that idea and wanting that idea, and throughout the book, and he's talking to you And that's one of the big themes of the story and the book itself is like you're supposed to be talking back. You're supposed to, the very first thing you're supposed to say when you hear that title is, wait, really? Or like, is that true? I don't think that's true. Like, have you been around? Have you lived life? Like, that's not, and then you start from there. I wanted that, like, I wanted you to be just like literally suspicious of his testimony at the jump. So, but I do love that title. I just said I love my own title. I'm sorry. I
You know
like,
what?
I didn't
Hey,
have,
you produced something beautiful, and I'm glad that you love it. I'm glad that you do it. That's okay. It's okay.
thanks.
Ray, um, so speaking to your title, and I'm going to try not to give too much away or anything, but one of the things I really loved about Dean is such a smart character, and I read it, from the perspective of a teacher, and I thought, I could imagine this kid, you know what I mean, like watching him grow, and he goes through a lot of disappointments, a lot of difficulties, a lot of soul searching, you know, but by the end of the book, he's able to say, the possibilities are endless. And I was like, God, that kid's so smart. What a great kid, man. So can you tell us about your title, Between Perfect and Real?
Yeah, totally. It's funny to me because I feel like titling things is always my hardest moment. Like it's really hard to come up with a title. And that was the first one that I ever came up with before I even had an agent when I was doing a fellowship with Hugo House, which is a local literary center. And I was like, well, like I wanted to represent, like, to me, the idea of the book is kind of like what you were talking about is, you start out, Dean has this like idea of like, this is what I need in my life. This is how my life will be like perfect. It's like, I need to, move with Zoe and my friends to New York City and go to NYU and like transition and come out there and I can start over. And then, by the end of the book, he kind of realizes like, oh, like I have something different and it's like not necessarily what I wanted. Spoiler alert again, I'm really bad at this, you guys. Also, this is Millie. So,
Hi, Millie.
Oh, baby.
But yeah, he realizes like, I think that like, in a subconscious or maybe unconscious way that like perfection isn't the goal. Like, what matters is like what's real, what turns out to be real is what he wants more or what is better for him. And Millie agrees. Yeah. So I actually, there's a point at which I chose like a different title for the book that I thought was like maybe more commercial or marketable. And then when I signed with my agent, she was like, can we go back to the other title? Because I think that like is more evocative of what the work actually is, which is not like I don't think my book is like a high concept, like plotty book. It's very much character driven. And so we went back to that and that's what it's been ever since. So I kind of feel lucky because I feel like other people cycle through a lot of titles and it just worked out for this one.
You had it right the first time.
Oh, amazing.
Okay, Darcy, we only have like 5 minutes left, but I do want to, and I'm sorry, I've been forgetting to hold these up. I do want to talk about the title of your book, a beautiful name, Elatsoe, that I had never heard before. And in the introduction, you talk about you have grandmothers, and you put Elatsoe in quotation marks. Is this a family name? Can you talk to us about this choice?
Yeah, I think that's Anita Elatsoe Soto, actually, is my grandmother on my maternal side. And so with us, we're given names like way after we're born. These names are really able to be customized to the person they belong to. So I write with the name Little Badger. If you look at my diploma, the full name is Darcy Aaron Little Badger Ryan. And Little Badger itself is actually derived from our creation story, specifically the badger, which not a god, but for an audience not familiar with our culture, I describe it. Pretend it's a god. Okay. So I'm little for a god. In other words, I'm not little for a person. Anyone who knows that, knows me will know that. And my grandmother, similarly, her name is the given name, Elatsoe, and that means hummingbird. So I do in the book explain a little bit when Ellie is with her friend Jay, and he's like, "Oh, I didn't know your full name's Elatsoe," and she explains the origin of that term in Lipan, and it does come from our Lipan language. So really, I've always wanted to name this book Elatsoe. Originally, I was thinking it'd be part of a trilogy, so there'd be a subtitle. But it's just so driven by the character, and also just to add that connection to my grandmother, part of a line of ancestors who influenced me, who are the reason I am a writer and a storyteller. I thought that was really cool that that connection was there as well. So it's kind of honoring her.
You know, it's interesting you talk about the trilogy because the end of the book, I was like,
I know. Unfortunately, it's the type of thing where writers like often don't
there
have
could
control,
be
but
more, maybe
yeah,
not.
that's
I
what I
don't
say.
know.
I never
There
rule
could
it
be.
out.
Awesome. So we do have a few questions from our attendees. Oh, where did they go? I got this. I got this, y'all. It's not Zoom, but I got this. Okay, Sherry. Sherry asks, and this is a question for all of you. Was it always your intent to, as an author, to target the young adult audience? So, Darcy, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I've always wanted to write young adult books, so that was always an intention. But Elatsoe, actually, I started as an adult book because I thought I'd be writing an adult fantasy, and I got like 10,000 words in, realized it was not working out. It was just hard to write, and just that small change of character, making the character a teenager. I think the story always wanted to belong to her. So as soon as I made that change, I realized this has to be a YA book. It's destiny.
Ray, what about you?
Yeah, I love that. I feel like books often will just tell you like what they need to be in terms of like the format or the character or the voice, and it always feels that way where you're like, that's not working, and then it's like everything falls into place and you make the like right decision. So I love that. But yeah, it always my intent to write for a young adult audience. I like started writing this book because I didn't have any representation as a kid in YA fiction, and I like wanted to help change that. And I think teens are so brilliant, and especially these days. And I just, I was an educator for a short time, never like a teacher or a librarian, but like in aid positions. And I loved that feeling of being in a position to kind of like guide, but also learn from teens. And that's something that I now like hope to do with my book is both like give them a place to like feel seen and like have a home, and maybe shape their worlds a little bit. And then like have them, shape me. Like it's wonderful when I hear from like young people who are like, this is the book that I always like wanted, or like it's beautiful. Yeah.
Sweet. Daniel?
No, I still don't know. I still don't know what's up. I wrote it initially as an adult like essay, and like Darcy, I think I when I made that shift over to him being a middle grade sort of character, just the sort of the emotional truth of it really came out. He was still dealing with it in the moment, so then I wrote it as a middle grade novel, and that's where I still think it is. But then of course I think it gets shelved in YA, and then in Europe it's published as adult. So who knows? Who knows? I don't. I like to think that means it's for everyone, but that's not maybe what it means.
I
Who
don't know. I
knows?
love YA lit. I think it is for everyone. So sadly, we're out of time. We should have had 6 hours. I told the festival organizer this. We should have had 6 hours to talk about these books, but we didn't. I'm so sorry. Ray, would you mind holding up your book? Because I didn't have a copy to hold up. Woo! And just a reminder to everyone, first of all, thank you for coming out. And thank you to our amazing, oh God, these novels were such a treat for me. I really enjoyed them. Thank you, Darcy, Ray, and Daniel. Thank you to all of you who came today. Don't forget, you can buy them by clicking buy the book, the button on the festival site. And thank you for joining our conversation. Thank you for these wonderful stories that celebrate the power of, yes, the power of story and to give us perspective. And you guys need to read these books, and believe me, there are people out there who needed these books. So thank you so much to all of you. Have a wonderful rest of your Sunday.
Bye, everyone.
You too.